Okay, got quite a few to get through here. Quite a few to get through here. Some terrible ones. Most of them are terrible. But anyway, after reading Theodore Kaczynski's otherwise known as the Unabomber's Manifesto, I not only found it cogent and informed. By the way, I haven't actually read all of it, and I'm still reading it now. I've just got to the part. The subtitle, I guess, called The Future. So, and I have some. But anyway, this was written when I probably read about half of it. I not only found it cogent and informed, but alarmingly similar in its assertions to the book that I found so informative recently, Lost Connections. Not its assertions, but its analyses. Anyway, yeah, just thought that was interesting. I wonder if Johan Hari has ever read it. This new thing came up in YouTube. This new video genre got suggested to me on YouTube. People playing a game called Beat Saber, and I thought it was kind of cool. It's like those videos that people you often see of like really, really nerdy people fighting with broomsticks. I imagine they finally got something that, because it does look quite fun and cool. It looks like Guitar Hero, obviously, but with lightsabers chopping things. And it gives them a little thingy. VR communities to replace or subsidise/supplement real life ones. So yeah, I just think that's something that's going to be quite important. So obviously when I talk about this again later, but when I was talking about how Twitch and ASMR and stuff like that are kind of subjugates, that's not a word. I guess that kind of sounds like surrogates, so maybe I was thinking of surrogates. Subjugate. Anyway, real life relationships, because something that's identified by Theodore Kaczynski is that it's not as easy to have, well, he doesn't actually, I'm not sure if he actually says this, but it's kind of implied, it's not so easy to have meaningful relationships anymore. And so I think they go some way to satisfying that need, I guess. Anyway, he would obviously say it's insufficient and we need to return to primitive ways, but I just think that's wrong, which I outline later. That's rubbish. Compose songs for Sherlock show on keyboard, open brackets MIDI, close brackets, don't learn chords, make up own. Stupid idiot. Use numbers rather than letters for notes / chords, and number each key, because then I pictured it, I don't know, I just thought it being numbered would mean you could do some simple maths. That might allow you to remember it easily. I have this idea for a quote-unquote thing. I'm not really sure what it is. I'm not really sure what it's for, but I'll outline its origin after I describe the idea itself. Basically, the idea is some people get an extortionate amount of money in a very short time span by winning the lottery, say. Experience the thrill and elation that such an injection of wealth provides, but subsequently give the vast majority of the money to some similarly small number of people. And those people too go through the same cycle, being overwhelmingly grateful to the providers of the huge sum, then giving almost all of it away, keeping only as much as is likely to be essential or highly useful in their lives. The act of giving it away bestows its own sensation of elation. But the idea being everyone experiences the momentary boost such an unnecessary amount of money produces, and the relief obviously, but also receives the fulfillment of generosity themselves. The idea came when reading Ted Kaczynski's manifesto and his proposed regression, not that he'd choose that word, to a more primitive lifestyle, which reminded me of Brad Pitt's character in The Big Short, and then made me think of the two characters his character aided to become millionaires. And more specifically, the moment he says something along the lines of, "Congratulations, you're both millionaires." For whatever reason, I found myself imagining, despite it not really being in keeping with the portrayal, Brad's character sharing in the elation of the newly millionaires, and then saying, "You realise this money's never going to be able to make you feel this way again, right?" Stupid. I just wrote down the words, the power process and surrogate activities. That's something that interested me in the thing. So yeah, the power process is, I'm not sure how much this would be against what Johan Hari kind of talked about, but I think it's somewhat correct. but it's very simplistic. So I'm not entirely sure that it's that surrogate activities don't satisfy it in a satisfying way, or satisfactorily. Anyway, surrogate activities, I think, if you get the right ones, could be good enough. I'm not sure inequality is a problem in itself, or rather, I don't think it's the problem we perceive it to be. It's more a symptom of the problem. For example, I don't think it would be a problem, assuming inflation or some other adaptive process didn't alter the market drastically. If every person, well, obviously, this is implying that we have enough wealth at this time. We don't have this amount of wealth, but we could. There's no reason to say that we can't eventually. I don't think it would be a problem if every person on Earth, or anywhere for that matter, had at least £500,000 as their own, and some small percentage of people had upwards of £50 million. So there would be inequality there, is what I'm saying. We know that past a certain threshold, money ceases to correlate with happiness. So pure inequality isn't the root cause of our problems. Well, it's not a problem with happiness. Addressing inequality would address the problem, but not directly. So yeah, if you address inequality, you will go some way to addressing the actual problem, but it's not because it is the problem. The problem is that some people are living in below the threshold of the amount of wealth they need to be happy. To have afford shelter and whatever. Sherlock grows bored of murdering. He's laughing maniacally while stabbing a body, and slowly the laugh becomes more obviously forced and fake, and he turns himself into the police, goes to prison, meets Moriarty, forms some semblance of a friendship with the man he framed. Who was Moriarty? Anyway. Something that comes across in much of Christopher Hitchens' speeches, and something I think he got quite right, is the idea that religion appeals to many people on the grounds that it can ameliorate and emancipate them of the need to be in absolute control of their existence. It offers all the answers, quote unquote, all the answers, so that you don't need to discover them for yourself. Hang on. It offers all the answers so that you don't need to discover them for yourself, and of course the argument is made, to him of course, rather than by him, that would it not be better for these people to be given the relief they claim this provides? Hitchens goes as far as to say this is an innate desire in all of us, and I find myself wanting to agree. I also find this argument to be, at least in my mental projections of my would-be adversaries, one that would be perceived to undermine my arguments for ethical egoism. But in response, I think the answer is quite simple. The answers, for the most part, have already been given. My concept of ethical egoism lends heavy credence to the projects of literature and philosophy since time immemorial. Oh, wow, you twat. We've been raised in a society that has evolved with its ideas as long as it has existed. Jesus Christ. This evolution has been stifled, yes, by obstacles such as religion. But it wasn't always an obstacle. In fact, in the early stages, I imagine it served as quite a stepping stone for many of the truly underprivileged factions of society. So yeah. In the opening of this book, I wish to start, or at least one of the ways I wish to start, in an unconventional manner. I invite you to answer a question. In fact, I invite you to ask yourself a series of questions which I will not attempt to answer for you, but in many ways the simplest questions imaginable. Perhaps the first questions you will have formulated as a child. The questions follow a simple formula. We start with a simple direct question. Why do you, or should you, why do you, or should you, do anything? And whatever answer you conjure, you then subject the monosyllabic follow-up question. You then subject it to the monosyllabic follow-up question of why, and so too to the answer to that question, and so on until you can ask and answer no more. It should be noted that the word do is not limited to physical actions. It merely denotes any verb in the current lexicon, and so think would be a perfectly reasonable substitute. Jesus Christ. More on the conclusions of Ted Kaczynski's manifesto. I don't think he's entirely right in that a return to a pre-industrial age would entail less suffering, or an undoubted increase in the satisfaction of his outlined power process. However, many of the issues he points out are real and will continue to degrade the quality and value of human existence. I believe I am, however, one of the reformers he scoffs at. And one aspect I think needs to be addressed is the social and cultural lack of disrespect towards greed. We need more Ebenezer Scrooge stories, and perhaps we can take a leaf out of Christianity's playbook, at least according to Nietzsche. Much like the plebeians made a power play to denounce many aspects of the rich and powerful, we must look to denigrate the lives of the greedy, and reward those of the philanthropic, yet not confuse industriousness with greed in its own right. Those who make much money but share it should be lauded. Here's another aspect of religion that I think most probably inadvertently got another aspect of religion that I think most probably inadvertently it got right. The acknowledgement that you aren't smart enough to know what's best for you, unless of course you recognise this, which is in a sense the Socratic idea of intelligence, being smart enough to know you know nothing. So I've stated before many times that we are engaged in the most complex game theory problem in existence, and have been since the evolutionary process began. Through ingenious methods, some innate in our biology, genes and non-blank slate traits, and through human technologies such as the written and spoken word, we are able to develop and draw on wisdom that grows over time, and we start to realise what works and what doesn't. Religion ascribed this body of wisdom to an omniscient supernatural being, which was almost certainly a simple misinterpretation of our circumstances. But it likely worked better than having no reason at all to act on the truth I believe I've highlighted. So, conventional wisdom. Furthermore, what I remain convinced would be the most common interpretation of my assertions is that I am advocating egotism. But I can only hope I've done enough to make it clear that to ignore the wisdom of our species is folly. To believe that you are smart enough to solve this game theory problem yourself in every moment would be almost as miraculous as many of the claims religion makes for itself. And what's more, you'd not only be assuming that you are capable of knowing the solutions to this game theory problem, but that you know it to be in contradiction to the wisdom of the generations, literature and so on, Otherwise, there would be no distinction between acting egoistically, and acting in accordance with conventional wisdom, with what conventional wisdom dictates. Okay. Listening to an interview with Jonathan Haidt, which featured Jordan Peterson as a panellist, I found it interesting when Haidt began discussing morality in a semi-relativist way, stating that liberals viewed giving money to starving children in Africa as more moral, whilst conservatives viewed taking care of your family and community as more moral, or like higher up the moral hierarchy or whatever. And I found myself wondering how this would fit into my arguments for ethical egoism, not only being the reason behind all morality, but in fact being the correct and only basis for any morality. And how can you decide which morality is better? The liberal or the conservative view? And I actually think we're in a period of transition. So remember the objective of morality from my perspective is to maximise the eudaimonia of your life across time. For a very long time, it likely would have been ultimately best for you to act almost solely in the interest of your immediate family and local community. Just got distracted. For a very long time, it likely would have been ultimately best for you to act almost solely in the interest of your immediate family and local community, but as Peter Singer has pointed out, advances in morality are characterised by an expansion of our circles of compassion. I'm not sure he actually used the word compassion, but anyway, that's kind of the gist. And so as the percentage of the world we come into contact with has increased through technological advances, so too the benefits of helping people who are traditionally detached from us have increased, and the cost of not helping those not in our immediate vicinities increased also. So moving from conservatism to liberalism, I guess. Well, at least in what Jonathan Haidt recognises as their moral bases. I think I have a newfound respect for Christopher Hitchens. I think in the past I was limited in my appreciation of him by my ability to truly understand everything he said, and certainly wouldn't claim to be able to do so now even. His depth of knowledge of history dwarfs what I do or would ever want to know. But for whatever reason, perhaps my increased application to reading, I now find myself able to appreciate him more fully, and I think he might have been the perfect person to counter much of the less savoury aspects of Jordan Peterson's espousals. In response to the manifesto still in question, actually Jordan Peterson and him both had similar relationship with Marxism and socialism and stuff, so yeah, that'd be interesting to... Anyway, still think Christopher Hitchens would probably smack him to the ground. In response to the manifesto still in question, we need greater emphasis on interpersonal relations in society. Individualism is essential, but must not be confused with isolationism. I'm not sure it's a thing, but anyway. We are all individuals that must learn to cooperate in every sense with other individuals. We need to improve the opportunities to form and maintain stable, long-term friendship groups. I think one of the technologies that will actually improve this, probably counter to most people's intuitions, is virtual reality. The ability to spend time with large social groups from the comfort of your respective homes will go a long way to countering the crowding issues rightly recognised in the Kaczynski Manifesto. I actually think, and I was dubious about this before, that Twitch is doing a decent job staving off the unbearable dissociation from social interaction that will continue to increase until we solve these problems. Our work environments are not conducive to these sorts of relationships, and in fact are not seen as preferable in the eyes of upper management, as they often appear on the surface disruptive to immediate productivity. Also, the almost necessity for people to travel long distances from their places of origin forces people to find new social groups, which without aid from local communities can be daunting and objectively challenging. Another thing religion misinterpreted and misimplemented was its understanding of what Weinstein has referred to as metaphorical truths. What it did right was recognise patterns, and this is one of the things we humans are known to be very good at. Sometimes good. Sometimes we are good at it so much that we find them when they're not really there. It recognised patterns of behaviour that for reasons which they should have realised they couldn't say why. For reasons they couldn't understand, they should have known that they couldn't understand the reasons. But anyway, they recognised that certain behaviours had certain consequences. Again, an irrational person would have been able to recognise these patterns and avoid jumping to conclusions as to their origins or underlying causality until sufficient evidence was discovered to support a hypothesis and turn it into a theory. Just think of our approach to the incredibly counterintuitive quantum world. The way religion went truly astray was when it decided not only that it had recognised these patterns, but that these patterns were indicative of the will of an omnipotent and omniscient creator. Gee, that was hard, and that is one of the easiest things to say in the world. And on this basis, were inherently right, and even more so. But that these patterns were indicative of the will of an omnipotent and omniscient creator, and on this basis were inherently right, and even more so that people who acted in ways that were likely to lead to these undesirable effects, most often from the perspective of the perceived transgressor, so in their own interest, they'd be the one paying the price anyway, should be punished prior to the effects that they suspected awaited them. Prior to the effects that they suspected awaited them arose. There we go. So punishing people, even though they're the ones who are likely to suffer, and punishing them before the effects have actually arisen. But what they should have been doing was searching for the actual reason these patterns occurred. Granted, they did this to an extent when they invented God, and they could hardly have been expected to formulate the entire framework of scientific inquiry without sufficient knowledge acquisition, but more importantly, should have been searching for ways to mitigate the negative outcomes of these patterns. Shitting in camp, for example. Don't do it. The pattern likely was when people were given free rein to defecate as they please, diseases seemed to occur more often than if they defecated away from camp. So pattern recognised. This is like the order. So, pattern recognised. What next? Well, obviously, stop defecating in camp until you have a grasp on why it might be, and a reason to believe you have the right reason. A god who didn't like it when you shat in camp was their reason. Ours, supported by decades, if not centuries, of evidence, is the germ theory of disease. Without this understanding, we would be right to be cautious of shitting in our very own households. But we are able to mitigate the issue because we have developed irrigation and sewage systems and plumbing and antibacterial soap. So I wonder, this is going out on a limb here, but I wonder if the things that seem most unsavoury to us about religion now, so like aversion to homosexuality, I actually don't know enough about HIV and AIDS, but I know that HIV and AIDS is more likely to spread in homosexual communities because of the nature of anal sex and unprotected anal sex, and I think because it's a smaller community and stuff like that. Anyway, I wonder if that was one of the patterns that got recognised, even if I don't know whether HIV was around in that same way. So maybe they recognised that people who had homosexual sex seem to develop this disease called HIV. Well, obviously they didn't know it as that, and then decided, well, that must be because God doesn't like it, when really there was a more disease germ theory that they should need to understand. Well, anyway. So yes, and then obviously they made a mistake because once they ascribe it to a false premise, they then use that premise to justify treating people poorly. I mean, obviously you're going some way to mitigating the actual disease by, if you don't allow the thing that's somewhat causing it to happen, but to then punish people, they just got an awful lot wrong. Recognising the pattern doesn't necessarily mean that you should. It tells you what to do about it. Whatever. I think my main issue with Kaczynski's thesis is when he says fairly explicitly, we would all be better off. When he says fairly explicitly, we would all be better off. Granted, I've already done this, I think. Anyway, granted, he would say eventually, if we did not have an industrial society at all, and if we all lived in a more primitive setting. This doesn't ring true for me for reasons for multiple reasons, Ollie. First of all, I think the reason industrial society came to be is that it allows far more people to live, even if he argues that this life will necessarily be undesirable because it hinders fulfillment of the power process. It allows far more people to live, as in literally people to be alive. I doubt he would argue that if we were to revert to living in small tribes, we wouldn't be able to support anywhere near the population we can and will be able to sustain under our industrial technological society. I think oh my God, I am so bad at speaking. I think an interesting thing to recognise is that whilst many small tribes individual members likely do lead more fulfilling lives, this is not the case across the board, and their way of life puts considerable limits on the numbers of individuals able to have it. But if we look through our history, one of the disturbing constants throughout is the presence of, and especially among prospering societies, slaves, and how only when technology advances to a sufficient degree to where slavery is no longer the most viable option for getting work done does emancipation begin. Consider the Industrial Revolution concluding towards 1840 and the Emancipation Proclamation occurring approximately 20 years later, 1863, I think. He is not wrong in his conclusions. That much of the system robs us of opportunities to fill many of our innate needs, but I don't believe it necessarily obstructs them indefinitely. Traffic is a problem he rightly detests, but with driverless cars acting in unison, this will diminish rapidly. Feelings of autonomy have been lost, but knowledge of this should give us opportunity to counter it. And he obviously says that you won't be able to do enough with reform. But anyway, smaller organisations with greater emphasis on democratic leadership is one option. But one I don't actually think is that great. But anyway, but autonomy could also be introduced in other areas, and the limits of autonomy are necessary. Without them, cooperation becomes inconvenient. I'm going to have to pause it here to do these last ones because I'm running out of time on the thing before it becomes too big. Okay, back with it now. Back with it. We are back with it. To follow up on what I said about slavery, I think it should be blatantly obvious that the end to slavery would never have come if there weren't a viable alternative to having slaves. Machines are surrogate slaves. Thankfully, we have little reason to believe they are conscious, and even less reason to believe they are capable of suffering, or that the purposes for which they were designed cause them to suffer. And yeah, I think the same thing. We'll find the same thing in many ways. It's just the old path of least resistance thing. So we won't have. We won't all be sufficiently vegetarian, or well, we won't be able to cease factory farming and all that until it becomes easy enough. Obviously, most people argue that being vegan and vegetarian is just as easy, but it's really not. Definitely not as easy to get the right amount of nutrition from your diet. It definitely doesn't require less effort to do it. The whole world is catered towards meat eating, and that needs to change if people are going to change. Just like people wouldn't have stopped having slaves, or people wouldn't have been willing to stop having slaves. Like you would have had. It would have been impossible to convince the ancient Egyptians not to use slaves to build their pyramids because they wanted pyramids built, and there weren't any other ways to get that done. So yeah, But once you have an industrial revolution, it becomes possible. Okay. I forgot to mention one of the most important imperatives to counter the issues raised in Kaczynski's manifesto is universal basic income. This really is the cornerstone of restoring much of people's freedom, and will of course be somewhat dependent on the introduction of sufficiently intelligent AI to take over, even though he actually discusses AI to some extent anyway, to take over. This was one of the last things I read, and I read it after writing this, but anyway, to take over the least desirable jobs. But a better understanding of what people can do to replace these jobs must be sought. VR will go some way towards this. And will of course be somewhat dependent on the introduction of sufficiently intelligent AI to take over the least desirable jobs, but a better understanding of what people can do to replace these jobs must be sought. VR will go some way towards this, and increase in the number of people interested in the production of art in its many forms also. Friends, social interaction, and community will become even more essential. And I think that goes hand in hand with VR communities. I think that will be something that will allow us to, interact in a virtual realm. Anyway, I was wondering whether to remember something. I found that the best place to look, as in literally look with your head when you're remembering, is left, down, or maybe a little bit down and left. I wonder if that's got any reason for that. I know there's that thing where you're looking with your eyes tells you what you're doing with your remembering and stuff like that. Something that's just occurred to me that I'm not overly attached to as an idea is that waiters aren't overly dissimilar in their relationships with customers to slaves and their masters. Obviously, it's not slavery when they opt in and they're paid, but it just struck me as a relatively servile employment. I imagine that many other occupations can be considered in the same way. So, yeah, there's quite a lot of jobs which are, if you weren't being paid, and if you hadn't chosen being, operative word there, to work there, it would be tantamount to slavery, like working in a factory. You can, well, I don't really know what I'm getting at. Anyway, I'm just going to leave it there, and that'll do. Pig.